How to draft the optimal best ball roster in 2025. That's what we're going to talk about today on RotoViz Overtime. We get lots of questions, comments, and so on each and every week. We have a great listener question that's going to be the basis of today's show, but lots of questions coming in on the YouTube channel or through DMs on Twitter and so on, looking at like what the team looks like, how the team is, what should we be doing this year in the current landscape and environment for best ball drafts. So we're going to talk about that today. We'll talk a little bit of Superflex best ball as well, because Shawn isn't on Twitter, but that's something that's been circulating around the Twitter sphere over the last week. Some people loving it, some people hating it. I think Superflex format is one of the best. Maybe, Shawn, it's just that we've had a lot of fortune in it over the years, but I'm a big fan of those Superflex best ball drafts over at the FFPC in particular, hoping to challenge to take one of those down again this season. But Shawn, best ball, we're going to do dynasty later in the week. We're trying to cover it all. How are you doing as we get ready to talk another fun week of fantasy here?
Good. Colm, this is the perfect time of the year to play all the formats. We've got lots of RV Triflex startups going. We're going to talk some startup strategy on the second show of the week. Ben and I drafted an early main event. Talk about the biggest of contests. We did that for Stealing Bananas this week. That show will be out soon after this one is available. We had the 111 and Colm. You've had a chance to listen to that one. We had some very exciting players fall to us, really at 3 different spots in that draft. And then obviously, as you work through, you've got to try and decide what players are going to be values now versus which players might be values a couple months from now, right? If you're going to draft early, you want to try and figure out how you can exploit the timing to the best of your ability, right? Whatever opportunities may be available now, you take advantage of those. And Colm, the same thing is true for best ball. Michael Dubner has done some great research through the years showing what the best times to draft are. I think you want to take that big picture knowledge, which tends to be, very early after the NFL draft and then right before the season. And there are reasons why that makes sense. Right after the draft, you still have some very large exploitable opportunities as people kind of get comfortable with what the new ADP is. And then right before the season, you have a lot of information. And especially if you're competing in tournaments against everybody, then you want your best ball roster specifically to have as few holes as possible, right? We know we have had great research on RotoViz from Jake talking about just how devastating those holes are. Colm, that will come into our conversation here in a moment. But you talk about normal best ball, Superflex best ball. I mean, Superflex is probably the way to play almost everything. We're probably not too far removed from main event formats that have this Superflex element as well. Let's dive into this.
Yeah, I would rather let's go Superflex and eliminate the kickers from the main event. I'm down for that, Shawn. But yeah, it's become so popular across the dynasty sphere in particular, and I think it's going to sneak its way into more popularity as people get. I think it's always when people aren't comfortable with something, maybe they don't want to jump in head first, but jump into some of these Superflex best ball leagues. I would highly recommend it. I was talking to Shawn before we kicked off today, and some of the things that I'm noticing from listeners coming up kind of on a consistent basis is around the rookies. Obviously, we do a lot of talk, Shawn, about the rookies. There's the rookie guide, and we go through the draft process and the value of drafting players pre-NFL draft, but also the edge that is there post-NFL draft ahead of the NFL season. Loading up on rookies is something that I think still is quite an uncomfortable feeling for people at this time of the year, with not knowing as much, and maybe the player doesn't pan out instantly, and particularly for people who are drafting 0 RB rosters and they're looking at the running backs that are coming off the board in the 8th round, the 9th round, and they're seeing some of those veteran names versus maybe some of the names that we've been talking about, the likes of a Tootin who is competing with 2 other names going in those exact round ranges, and having that comfortability to say, week 1, week 2, it might take a little bit of time for this to work in, but we're building it to be at the end of the season and have that juggernaut when all things are done. I think it's a positive time of the year to talk because the rookies are in people's minds already, but that is something I feel people should be a lot less worried about. The reality of when you're in these big best ball tournaments in particular is you mentioned you have to beat everybody. You have to beat everybody. So when you have to beat everybody, you have to have a team that is going to be completely a difference maker and not a case of like drafting for the floor. So I'm interested in your thoughts, Shawn, on drafting those rookies, whether it's rookie wide receivers, tight ends, running backs at this point of the year, and then worrying about that early season floor. Because I'm noticing that coming up where there's that balance of maybe you take 2 or 3 rookies as 0 RB candidates, but you're also sprinkling in some of the veteran names like a Javonte or a ETN. Even though those guys could potentially have good seasons, they're not the profiles that we're targeting to, I love to reference the Stealing Bananas show where he's, preview the first 2 rounds of the following season. Like, it's very unlikely that we're seeing Travis Etienne or Javonte Williams in there next year. But like we did with Bucky Irvine last year, he's the example of who's going in the 10th plus round that could jump up there if you're drafting the 0 RB roster. So should people be concerned about not overdrafting, but adding too many of these rookies to their either redraft or best ball lineups at this time of year?
Yes. And that can be tough when the rookies are also the best values and the likely league winners, right? So Blair has done lots of research on this topic over the years, and it's always a little bit hard for us to take. When I say us, those of us who really want to go young with the roster. And this is one of those areas where you do need to understand the differences between redraft and best ball. One of the reasons that it's so much fun to play all of the formats is that they are different, right? If you just played them all exactly the same way, then you wouldn't need to have that much variety. You could take the one that you like slightly better and just play everything in that. In the main event that Ben and I just participated in, once we got into the double-digit rounds, we basically just selected rookies because you're not expecting much production from those spots anyway. And when I say that, it's that the players who are there and are veterans come through for you. They're generally not coming through for you with the type of production that you can put in the starting lineup on good teams. And when you take shots on unproven players, they generally just don't pan out at all. Now, you think about what that means for redraft, where you're constantly churning the bottom of your roster. Colm, I'm sure that you and I have had some big free agent pickups on our main event teams. I know that globally speaking, you go back through the years and you look at all of the best teams on these big redraft lineups. And yes, you generally hit on lots of guys early. You generally hit on a sleeper late. But the other thing that you tend to see on those teams is that you tended to make one pretty big free agent acquisition that was able to maybe paper over other concerns or add just that extra juice that put you over the top, where now you have the super lineup. In redraft, you want to be thinking about that as a key part of the process, both from the perspective of, like, let's make sure we go out and do it, but also from the perspective of understanding that the guys that you draft, especially in the double-digit rounds, are probably not going to be, certainly on a percentage basis, the guys that you're still staring at in those spots when you get to the end of the season. Best ball, obviously, very, very different, which comes back to this question of the holes. And one of the things that Blair's research has demonstrated is that it's actually the early rookies who matter, and the early rookies who often provide these outsized results on a percentage basis. So the thing that we have to kind of think through here is that it's a little bit counterintuitive in that the area where you could actually comfortably take a rookie and feel like that player might crush for you is going to be early in the draft, which is one of those things where if you're a big fan of GT, if you're a big fan of Hampton, if you're a believer in Henderson, if you like McMillan or Hunter, those picks, as much as they make people uncomfortable, or some people uncomfortable, are actually probably very good picks. Now, again, you want to go and look at each individual player profile. You want to go and look at each selection every time you're on the clock and ask yourself, is this the best pick for this roster today, for all of the different tactical reasons and contextual reasons that might come up. You look then at the double-digit rounds, and maybe you employ a little bit more conservatism in terms of thinking through what is this rookie likely to do, or what can this rookie accomplish for me in terms of the various likelihoods versus other things I could do. So then, Colm, I think we have to throw in this additional point of, yes, there are still going to be some rookie difference makers late, and you're going to want exposure to those. So how do you get that? And then also this question of every season is not the same. And things that we know have worked in the past or have been the case in the past will not necessarily carry over to any specific season in the future. With that being the case, is 2025 different enough in some way that it would make us want to move off of what we have sort of known to have been the case in the past? I'm not saying that we have that in 2025, but certainly you have to at least think through it from the perspective of this rookie running back class being fairly unique. And fairly unique, I think, in terms of that double-digit round area where you can go back and look in the past and say, okay, we have running back classes that have similar top-end talent to Genty and Hampton and Henderson, Judkins, these guys. They're very, very good, but we have classes that are similar. Do we have classes with people like Scadaboo and Tootin being taken on day 3? Do we have classes with guys like Giddens and Gordon and Brashard Smith being taken at the very end of drafts? That is much more rare.
It is, but I do think there's an environment, Shawn, this year with how you set out there with the rookie running back crop that makes it much more intriguing. And that comes into the part about we know the historical information, the historical data of what has worked, but we also have to adapt to the current year and some current trends as well. The part of that question, and to go back to the question that I probably should have read this out when we kicked things off, was from Jamin. He is a rookie or a best ball team that we're going to review later in the show, but he mentioned he took a lot of rookies. Will he dig himself into too big of a hole if his team falls behind? Typically with slower starting rookies, with the balance between the upside and then some of the boring guys in limited roles with better floors early in the season. So I think Shawn has kind of talked through the majority of that particular part. But to show you, just to go into the team to kick things off, it starts off, it's a super flex team of Brock Bowers, Puka Nacua, Garrett Wilson, Justin Fields, Xavier Worthy, JJ McCarthy, Shawn Judkins, Jordan Addison, Jalen Warren, Cam Scadaboo, Tootin, Aaron Rodgers, Jaden Higgins, Trey Henderson, Brashad Smith, Harold Fanning, Jarquez Hunter, Terrence Ferguson, Jalen Royal, Sean Tucker. So when we look, Shawn, this year and talking about that environment, I do think the likes of like Judkins, Scadaboo, Tootin, Brashad Smith, Jarquez Hunter, I think they're probably going to be priority targets or pretty close to priority targets across the season. And then tight end premium in particular, Fanning and Ferguson, I think will be priority targets. And, you know, when we look through that crop of running backs, we have a question in a minute versus the wide receivers in terms of should you have drafted more wide receivers. But I think that the profiles that have been drafted there in the back half of the draft from particularly round 10 onwards makes that kind of environment that you're after touching on potentially possible this offseason.
Colm, when you look at these players, I mean, this team is very, very excited that Jamin has put together here.
The back half of this draft is pretty much Shawn Siegele's priority target list for 2025, if anyone's looking for it.
I mean, it's pretty exciting. So it kind of goes back to the same question that I deal with when I am drafting teams. And frankly, Colm, I'm comfortable going against some of the historical trends we just talked about because they're my personal teams. And if I'm wrong, then all I have to deal with it for is myself, right? When we are making recommendations to the OT community, we want to put out there and make sure people are understanding some of the risks. And so the thing that I'm always thinking about in my head as well is just the thing that I mentioned, right? Which is that the rookies are probably actually better bets early when you're thinking, okay, well, I still actually have veteran guys I feel comfortable selecting there. And so that's the thing, is that I think if we have a lot of late rookie targets, then mostly what we're trying to do in the first 10 rounds is actually take a bunch of veterans so that the team isn't like super unbalanced. The problem is that actually leans into this element that I've been discussing where maybe that's really pretty counterproductive. And yet I do think that the other thing you have to do as a drafter is figure out your own board and work through who you think the targets truly are. And if you were comfortable with these guys and you're comfortable with some of the production that you're going to get, I mean, it's important in best ball to not have a bunch of 0 scores. But the thing that we want to understand is that veterans who are being drafted in these late rounds, in just so many cases, are also very, very low projection guys.
And the likelihood, again, to go back to that
the projection doesn't change.
Yeah, and it doesn't have that spike potential to, next year to be high draft capital players.
And so as we're thinking through, if there are too many rookies and you have this sort of stretch here where we get Scadaboo, Tootin, you have a quarterback in there, but then Higgins, you Benson in there, but Brashard Smith, Fannin, Hunter, Ferguson, Royals. Maybe this is a team where you just don't take Royals because maybe that is a pick that I get too excited about because of the Chiefs element and because he was underdrafted. But if he's still completely blocked, then maybe that's a chance to take a veteran instead. Maybe take someone like a Troy Franklin. Now, I mean, the problem with that is, again, you're taking someone who really does need a big change in what happened a year ago. With Royals, we don't know that he already had a bad rookie season like we know for Franklin. Franklin, another guy, vastly underdrafted. Maybe that contributed to his rookie season struggles. I mean, mostly he just didn't catch deep passes, which he was open for, which, I mean, you got to go ahead and make those plays, right? But that would be a possible option for moving in a different guy. One of the things I want to talk about here with FFPC Superflex is that the Roster Construction Explorer really wants you to take a lot of tight ends, and this is true for the regular format as well. Colm, is something that you and I mean, we like to take the early tight ends, but then one of the things we have to do is also force ourselves to take late tight ends. You just have to have a lot of tight ends. And it gets to the feeling where it's almost weird, like, why are we selecting so many tight ends? But it goes back to the format, right? I mean, this best ball format, FFPC best ball format, is really dramatically different than some other best ball formats you may be playing. And the tight ends in this, it's just much, much more valuable. You go into the tight end spot, you maybe go into the flex spot, you maybe go into the super flex spot. Colin, we haven't gone into it yet, but this is a team style at QB that we really like, where you take Fields in 4, you take McCarthy in 6, you get that third QB with Rodgers. This is, I mean, the specifics of it are going to change a little bit year to year. I don't think you want to get so wrapped up in, what round you want to take someone in, because every year the prices at QB are going to be a little bit different, and you need to go where the prices are for the guys who are your targets, right? But this style of QB build has been very effective. One of the things from last year I was chatting with Connor about when it happened, because I think he finished second. Connor obviously dominating the FFPC best ball formats through the years. Just absolutely fantastic best ball player and super cool guy there. The team that won only had Bryce Young in the lineup in week 17, right? So it's not that you don't want to have QB firepower if it's given to you. And the whole reason you take Justin Fields and JJ McCarthy here is that either of those guys could blow up massively and score a ton of points. But when you take them here, then you allow yourself to build this team with Bowers and Puka, where you're like, I mean, the teams that have QBs, name QBs, elite QBs, and a lot of the QBs being drafted in that range are not elite, right? I mean, you have to really distinguish between a Daniels, a Jackson, an Allen, maybe a Hurts, and then the rest of the guys. Because once you get to the rest of the guys, you're basically just already into the Justin Fields territory. Guys who are being drafted in round 1 essentially have the same, and in some cases, weaker projections than what you should be expecting from Justin Fields. So we, in this format specifically, right? So we love that pick there.
And just to go in, Shawn, you mentioned, this particular style of team. Zero quarterback doesn't quite, cover it, but essentially a lot of people will try and draft 2 quarterbacks through the opening 2 rounds in Superflex, certainly 2 through the opening 3. This is a team where the first quarterback they've drafted is at the 403, the second one's at the 603, and then they take Aaron Rodgers, who we mentioned, at the 1203. So they are not prioritizing the QB position, I guess, and they're also picking out certain profiles. And I'd say the profiles fit more with the Justin Fields, JJ McCarthy, and then you're looking at, Aaron Rodgers being kind of a floor play there. But that's giving you the opportunity to get a Brock Bowers at 110 in a tight end premium format and then load up on those other plays. And the other thing, just to reference, in case people haven't heard us talk about the Superflex format, is you mentioned the tight ends, and in general, the data and the RotoViz tools will be suggesting 4+ tight ends, Shawn, I think, and we're looking at Bowers in the early rounds, then you might be waiting off, but then you're adding in the profiles because in the back end of these drafts, some of the tight ends are tight ends we just will not be looking to select, but the likes of a Fanning and a Ferguson, you're looking for that Trey McBride element, like who can make that jump up again to the top of the charts for 2026 drafts. But the other part, Shawn, I wanted to circle back to was the rookies versus the veterans. And another example, I did get message today that I pulled up with very similar back end running backs that we've already talked about, but rather than the Judkins, Warren, Scadabo area there with Tootin, also it was a case that it had Tony Pollard, Javonte Williams, and Travis Etienne. And that kind of is a case of like, is that too much? This is a question on the balance of the rookies versus the veterans. And you're looking at those guys are probably going to give you floor earlier in the season, but they also feel like they could potentially be dead zone backs come the midpoint of the season. Is that more about the profiles of the veterans that you're drafting in that area, or do you think that would be a way to balance it out, or maybe it's a case that you only want one of those guys on a roster like this?
Yeah, I think that the dead zone has gotten controversial because of what happened last season. Certainly, if you're going to throw out all of the knowledge we have over a very long period of time about how backs who are being valued based on projected early season workload and what they do to you, whether it's win rates in best ball, whether it's just being successful in your redraft leagues, if you throw that knowledge away, you're going to lose, right? And at the same time, that doesn't mean that in best ball, you wouldn't ever select any of those guys if you get great prices. But certainly what I would want to do when I'm building out my portfolio of teams is I would put some sort of rules in place for myself where I say no more than one dead zone profile back, and that back specifically in an instance where he falls, say, a half round below ADP. And then you're able to kind of check multiple boxes of having the humility, having the variety, right? The diversity within your profile, getting exposure to someone where maybe specifically even at that price, right? Where you're starting to build out some teams that have good ADP value in them as well. So if you're able to hit a lot of different objectives with a pick that in other cases is probably just objectively a bad pick, then I think you can do that. Right, because you are balancing different elements, including, as you mentioned, getting some veteran presence on the roster so that you can then throw in some younger guys late. I do think that we want to be looking for opportunities to balance some of these rookie running backs late with just powerful running backs early. So, Colm, we may have hinted at this a little bit. I'm sure that it's certainly implied in a lot of the shows that we've done, a lot of the drafts that we've done in the last year and a half, 2 years. Certainly in the Big Gorilla piece, I discussed it a little bit more in detail. But I don't know if I've come out just directly and said, I think that the way that you can exploit current pricing, current trends, current running back profiles, and this rookie running back class is essentially to do both, which is to take more of the star running backs early than we would have done in the past, and simultaneously then take these rookie running back profiles, with the idea being that it's certainly not guaranteed, but one very likely path that this 2025 season could take is that the best teams are the ones that take all of the knowledge of how you draft zero RB candidates, and you have a lot of them on your teams, but you also have just frontline running back firepower. And whether that means you're going to have more teams in 2025 that on a weekly basis are filling the flex with running backs, or you're building main event teams or big gorilla teams where you have 2 running back starters who dominate, and then you come back with flex 1 and flex 2 are both running backs and they both dominate, right? So you're putting 4 big time running back scores into the lineup every week. What we're always kind of looking to do is evolve how we're thinking about fantasy, evolve how we think about where the exploitable opportunities would be, and then always look, how do we score the most points? How do we dominate the flex position? How do we build super teams? And Colm, I think we can do that without getting ourselves kind of stuck in this area where we're not drafting scoring wide receivers. So much of what we've done over the last 15 years is also look at what wide receiver profiles outperform, and how do you get a huge number of points? Because I mean, one of the issues that some people have had through the years, and one of the things we've had at some points in time, is say, look, if you're struggling with zero RB, the problem is probably you're not drafting enough wide receivers. You're drafting this balanced team that doesn't really take advantage of either thing in terms of dominating wide receiver, dominating the flex, and then you're taking dead zone running backs still because you switch too early, and then those players don't score enough points, and you're looking at your lineup and you're like, where do I get enough points, right? Our idea here is that we're going to score a lot of points. Now, when we're thinking about best ball, we always want to bring it back to this idea of, with the optimized scoring, with all of those types of elements, have I set my roster up so that I have the different positions covered in the optimal way for how the scoring shape is going to be for the season, and weekly throughout the season, and then for the season as a whole. One of the things that you tend to see is that even in a season like last year, you look at the second half of last season, Colm, I certainly can't speak to the experience of every single member of the OT community, but when the veteran running backs were doing so well in the first half, even a lot of the teams that I had drafted that hit on a huge number of players, they weren't struggling exactly, but they weren't necessarily positioned in first and second place, ready to advance, all of those types of things, in part because it had been a zero RB build, something that Jake's research suggested. Certainly, there were things that Michael Dubner had looked at, suggested it very strongly. You don't necessarily have to push that hard for a RotoViz community to look at it and say, I mean, if the research is continuing to back up what we tend to do, we're probably going to do it. But over the second half, those teams continue to rise. And by the end of the season, the advance rates were very, very good. The teams that were in the playoffs were very exciting. Now, my portfolio in both redraft and best ball had a very poor week 15. And so, you lose a lot of your teams in best ball. The main event teams, when I did the Big Gorilla article, you can kind of look at those teams and how they performed very well in the sprint and the main event, but that really they were all dead after week 15. Week 16, week 17, they scored huge points. They climbed back into very nice spots. But week 15 was awful. Sometimes you have that week. Sometimes it's better to have it in week 15 than week 17. It's a little bit less of a heartbreaker. The last 2 weeks, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to root for my teams climbing, but I know that I'm done. That happens. You're going to have bad weeks every once in a while. But Colm, as we look at this and we consider those types of things, we also want to consider, especially in what we're talking about here with Superflex, Best Ball at the FFPC, that it is a very balanced format in terms of how you draft overall and how you draft early. And so that's kind of the other question here that we were asked. Is it not heavy enough at wide receiver? So you look at that big picture, maybe there are some spots between the Warren pick and the Ferguson pick that should be receivers that aren't, but maybe there are picks early that should be running backs instead. So you can kind of look at it from both directions. Do you have thoughts on that element as we try and build out specifically a team for this format?
Yeah, so to give some clarity on it, is a team that is 3 quarterback, 8 running back, 6 wide receiver, 3 tight ends. And I mentioned earlier, like 4 plus tight ends will be ideal in this format. But that also means then that you're having to take one of the other positions away. You do realistically need to have 3 quarterbacks in this when you wait on quarterback to the 4th and 6th rounds to kick things off. So the question is then, where do you take the balance from to fill it in another position? So with the 8-6 becoming the question, you kind of need to take one of those and make it a tight end. So you can't really go down to 8-5. And I think what you're talking through, Shawn, and the one thing that's interesting now, this is looking specifically at a specific format and knowing your settings. But in this format, running backs do become a little bit more valuable than the wide receiver position based on being able to set your flex. So your flex in most of the formats, the FFPC, for example, are going to be 2 flex spots. So you can put that to anything you want. But when you get into the super flex format, it is still just 2 flex spots. There's not an additional flex spot. So one of them will likely be your super flex. And we're talking about the tight ends, and the reason why having the 4, particularly if they're ones that can advance throughout the season and become strong scoring tight ends, is they can often outscore a low end QB in this particular format and fill that super flex spot for you. And as Shawn mentioned earlier, if you have more than the 2, so the tight end 1 and the super flex, you also have a flex spot with tight end premium in this format being 1.5 points. You can also put them in. So you can kind of look at this, that you need to be filling your 2 wide receiver spots, rather than in some formats we might be like, you need to have 2 wide receivers and then the 2 flexes being also wide receiver. And that's kind of what Shawn was talking about with the running backs. You have the potential to put them in the flex as well. So that takes a little bit of the necessity for the wide receiver, in my opinion, out of it in this format. And Shawn, that was something that for many years, I know when we were drafting in this format together, I battled with. I wanted to keep pushing for the wide receivers, but it eventually came that the right decision is to try and balance that out. So I don't know if we need 8 running backs. The one advantage though with the running backs picked here, really strong group that has been selected. Sean Tucker obviously had one big week last season. We liked his profile coming out of college. There is potential other options, maybe to add in the 20th round, potentially even another rookie tight end there. But you mentioned the Royals pick in the 19th round, the end of the 19th round being the 6th wide receiver. I think we could potentially have a 6th wide receiver earlier. And I think that we could have probably went up to the 7, but not necessary in this format for me, because we have Puka, we have Garrett Wilson, we have Xavier Worthy, Jordan Addison, and Jaden Higgins, all players who were really, well, the one there, the Wilson one is a little harder to be fully optimistic about. But I think it looks on paper, Shawn, like, having just the 6 wide receivers can be troublesome. But based on how the rest of the team is set up, you would be hoping, if you're drafting this team and telling yourself a story as to how it wins a championship, that it's going to be based on the superpower of those wide receivers filling the 2 wide receiver spots every week, sometimes filling the flex, but that you're looking at the 2 running backs and then some of them powering their way into the flex as well. The one question becomes that early season point scoring. And I think there's a safe floor there, Shawn, for Judkins as the season kicks off. I also think there's a safe floor there for Warren, and I think there's going to be enough for Scadabo straight off the bat that the 3 of them are going to be point scoring running backs. And I think that the likelihood that Judkins and Scadabo's scoring increases throughout the season is highly likely, as will the likes of a Tootin. So I think this is back to the kind of original question before we get into what Shawn thinks about the balance. I think the running backs drafted here give you that shade of potential early season floor, but also moving into the upside as the season progresses to have, supercharged team down the stretch, versus those players that I mentioned who we can also tell ourselves the story about, like, Travis Etienne coming back to form. The same story could be told with Javonte Williams on that one I told earlier, where they're healthy, they're getting all the work, they have a big strong season, they finish as an RB1. But I feel the profiles here fit that narrative much, much better. And they would be the ones that I want to have on the roster, because I can talk myself into a Judkins or a Scadabo being, in the first 4 rounds next season, where it's harder to do that with those other names that I talked about. So I think the balance, Shawn, is pretty good here. I would want 1 more tight end and maybe 1 more wide receiver, but I really can't fault the overall approach and the players in specific that are being drafted here. I think we could see ourselves filling out a roster. I don't know if I can see myself getting Shawn to draft Aaron Rodgers specifically, but I think that we
Colm at
could
this
put
price.
we could put this
That's that's a good price.
that's in the
Superflex.
the QB 30 at this particular point in the 12th round. So I think we can agree on the price there. But I think overall, Shawn, this is a very, very strong unit and a strong roster. And if this wasn't a super flex roster, I'd be saying the balance is off for wide receiver versus running back. But in this particular format, I think this is pretty strong.
Yeah, one of the spots I think that you could look at would be the Judkins pick. We like Judkins. Maybe Samson is the way to play that team. Even though, again,
I'll shout it out, Shawn, here. Who's going around Judkins that could potentially been taken in the Superflex format? So that round is the 7th round. It's Bryce Young, James Conner, Geno Smith, Travis Kelce, Travis Hunter, Devontae Smith, Cameron Ward, Zay Flowers, Cortland Sutton, Judkins, David Montgomery, Jameson Williams. I think the pick there for Shawn is the last name that I mentioned.
It probably is.
Jameson Williams.
One of the things we're looking at here with this team is that you're taking Garrett Wilson in order to kind of have that set up with Justin Fields. And I think that there are certainly scenarios where that is the league winning play. That Garrett Wilson actually has a very good season, and in the final week, he has a 2-touchdown game, and Fields also runs for a couple touchdowns, and you're like, okay, this was the play. One of the things when you look at these really heavy rushing QBs, you look at Josh Allen, for example, you can actually pair them with other good players as opposed to his teammates in the different tools and see that, having him not stacked, if you just have a better receiver, is the way to play it. And so the other thing you can think about there is, well, what if we take a running back in that spot and then take a wide receiver in the Judkins spot? You accomplish multiple things of removing a rookie running back, which again, I said this is probably the area where that would outperform, right? So you don't need to do that. But if you're trying to think through of how I would accomplish it, maybe you could flip that one. When you look here again with this idea of like, how would we limit ourselves in individual drafts? Now, across your entire profile, you want to be very heavy on it. And it's got to be there are 2 players I'm going to be massively overrepresented on. In this team where you end up having excellent running back picks late, maybe you take out the Tootin pick and that's where you get your 4th tight end in. I say that, it's easy to say it.
In hindsight.
It's hard. Well, in hindsight, but then also, it can be hard to force yourself to take tight ends who just aren't that shiny in comparison to some of their picks, which is the reason that you can go into drafts and maybe say, okay, I want 4, and then you get done and you don't have 4. Now, the other thing here is that you have Bowers in round 1, and so you're thinking that is going to shift things a tiny bit. One of the things that the Roster Constructor Explorer suggests is that it probably doesn't, but again, that would be a misleading takeaway from it probably, because the whole reason that you draft Bowers there is that you expect him to outperform what similar tight ends have done when they're picked that early in this type of format, right? Which is a very reasonable assumption to have. Not all first-round tight ends are the same. Not all first-round tight ends stay healthy, right? And so when you're talking about very limited numbers of players going into a category, then injuries to those players can really distort our view of like what works and what doesn't.
The reason I mentioned in hindsight is like sometimes, and I know we've had this in the past, Shawn, where you're in a draft and you're like, these are our priority targets through all these rounds. And all of a sudden you're like, all these players have come to us, every single one of them. Like when we go down through this list, there'll be other drafts where maybe if you do skip on that Tootin pick and then you don't get Jarquez Hunter, then you're like, I'm a bit short and running back on this roster. So it's tricky sometimes in the draft room. And that's where if you do a lot of drafts, you have the ability to eventually pair them all together. But really like this conversation as we worked our way through it and kind of give some of the different ideas for drafting, particularly in Superflex in 2025. We'll have lots more content. We'll have lots more drafts. We'll be starting up some listener drafts and so on. We have a lot of people who have been interested. I will be trying to get that set up in the next few weeks. I do promise that. I know I've been letting it sit for a little bit, but that is where we're going to finish up today's show. If you want to sign up over at rotoviz.com, you can use the code RVRadio2025 at checkout to get yourself a 10% discount off a 1-year RotoViz Pass. You can check out, Shawn mentioned on today's show, but lots and lots and lots and lots of positive feedback around the Big Gorilla article that he did publish over the last week or so. So much information. And I think it's called the Big Gorilla for the Big Gorilla Draft Tournament. It could be also called the 2025 Draft Bible, because it has everything in there that you're going to need for your drafts while you're on the clock. But check that out over on rotoviz.com. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland, over on Blue Sky, the exact same information. And you can check out Shawn's work, as I mentioned, up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.